Hi there, and welcome to another Insomnia Insight episode in which we will talk about nightmares. If you've had nightmares in general, or nightmares because you had trouble in sleeping in the past, and you're afraid of having trouble sleeping again, if that's the source of your nightmares, well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about in this episode. If you haven't really had troubles with nightmares, well, there are some general principles in this video that I think applies very, very widely. So with this said, let's jump in here and learn something from nightmares. Pardon me. And the reason we're talking about nightmares today is actually because just, I would say, like 30 minutes ago or something, I was answering comments on the YouTube channel and came across this one from a longtime supporter, Philip from Belgium, who writes the following. Hi, Daniel. Thank you for the videos. Every night I have chronic PTSD nightmares. So the problem is not so much anymore the insomnia itself, but the nightmares. I think the nightmares are a consequence of the once so severe insomnia. I looked on YouTube on how to stop nightmares. A therapy that always comes back is rewrite the script, is in a positive sense during the day. But how can I rewrite if the nightmares are different every night? Is it a good idea when I wake up during the night to rewrite it already during the night and then go back to sleep? I am very confused how, and I don't know what to do. Or do I have to treat nightmares as insomnia, hyperarousal, because they go hand in hand, question mark? Or are the nightmares, in fact, the hyperarousal itself? What do I tell my brain during a nightmare? I have so many questions. I know I cannot ask you all. I ask, but lastly here, do you have a video made on this topic, or do you have a good resource, something like that? I'm desperate. Or even better, can you make a video of it, question mark? Can you give me something to work on, please? Thank you in advance. Have a nice week. Philip. Thank you, Philip, for submitting this. And the question is, of course, yes, here we will talk about this right here and right now. And I've written down the 3 specific questions from Philip that we will go over at the end of this episode. But first of all, to be able to answer them in a logical way, let's take a look at nightmares right away. So one definition that I've come across is that a nightmare is when the content of a dream is so scary or so intense that it actually wakes you up. And I don't know necessarily that definitions are important, but this sort of rings true to me. It's not like we wake up, we go brush our teeth, and then we go like, oh yeah, that's right, I had a nightmare. Oh, that's not really what happens, right? When we have a nightmare, we wake up and immediately we're like, we're kind of still in the nightmare, in the content of what happened. And we wake up like, whoa. Now, if it was the dream content that woke us up, or we randomly woke up and then we just happened to be in a nightmare, I don't know, but it feels true to me that oftentimes the content is so intense that it actually does wake us up. So that rings true to me. Okay, so with this said, what is a nightmare? To me, a nightmare is a surface manifestation of fear. We can think of it as the waves of the surface of what's on the bottom is actually fear. So if you think of a body of water, you have the surface where things can happen, and then you have the depth, which you don't necessarily always see. But a nightmare, I think, is just a manifestation of fear, like palpitations, for example. I think I'm using palpitations because it's a very tangible example that I think is really helpful. So what I want to say here at first is that if we think about it in the kind of with this analogy of water here, we can see that trying to calm down the surface actually creates more waves because there will be more fear. And we'll look at this in detail, but just keep that in mind, the analogy. Like if you see waves on the surface of water, imagine if you literally try to like calm the water down, like putting your hands on that, it would just create more waves. And that is exactly what we are, what is not that pleasant, not what we're looking to experience, right? So if we go a little bit deeper into why this is, the surface and the depth thing here, well, imagine if you have this thought, you have palpitations, and then the interpretation of that becomes, these palpitations mean something is wrong. I have to stop them because they're wrong, and if I stop them, then I'll be okay, something like that. Well, in that interpretation, that is an interpretation that leads to more fear. It's scary. It's something unknown. It's something like something vague, something that you don't know what's happening, right? That leads to more fear, and therefore, because of naturally, when we're fearful, when we're in a state of fight or flight, we have more palpitations. Completely normal in that context. But then, when the interpretation of the palpitation is that something is wrong, then more palpitations means you think even more that something is wrong. you have even more fear, you have even more palpitations, and then you have this cycle, right? Well, if the interpretation becomes the opposite, these palpitations mean that I'm scared. And it's actually normal to have palpitations when we are scared. That means to less fear because it appears, logical, normal, nothing strange, nothing that needs to be fixed or problem solved. And then we have less palpitations, and the whole thing kind of fades. So this is how again, like if you look at what's happening on the surface as something wrong, it should be happening. You try to stop it, then you have more of it. But if you look on the surface and see that, oh, these waves are actually normal in this context, don't need to do anything, then the surface goes back to its kind of baseline state when nothing is disturbing it. It is calm. The surface is calm. So I think this very much the same thing applies to nightmares. If we interpret nightmares as a hurdle problem, something to be fixed, then we have more of them. If we interpret nightmares as a normal manifestation of fear, it's something that's expected when we have some fear, then we have less of them because there's no less attempts at stopping them, right? So with all this said, let's go back to 3 questions from Philip here. Number 1 is, do I treat, no, that was number 2, sorry. Here's number 1. Should I rewrite the script? Okay, I've come across this too, this idea that you can, rewrite the script. And, it seems like a pretty straightforward approach. I think if someone has had like a recurring nightmare, the same theme every night, and then thinks about a different ending to that nightmare, and that's helpful to them, well, why not? To me, it's an example of almost dismissing it, almost kind of brushing it off and just doing some little thing. And I think this sort of dismissal of an emotion, which is fear, can be helpful when that emotion is not very, very strong and very entrenched. It's, for example, I always go back to my same example, which is the example of melatonin. Somebody has this thought that, oh my gosh, I can't sleep without melatonin. If that person can go meet this thought with, by the way, this thought comes from fear too, so it's kind of all the same thing, but now we're just using the example of a thought. I can't sleep without melatonin. They feel kind of a little bit, this is a little bit scary, and they can meet this with, that's nonsense. I've slept so many times without taking that. If that kind of dismissal of the thought, rewriting the script, if you will, if rewriting the script like easily, makes that thought go away and it doesn't come back, then why not? It's a nice and easy way to meet some kind of like, fear that isn't very, very profound, if you will. So in a way, I guess when there's a tiny little wave, you can, in a way, like gently, like, make it go away. Like, I know that doesn't make sense, but just to tie everything together, I'll say that. And so I think if you have if the nightmares aren't that sticky and aren't that kind of like, rooted in a very entrenched fear, you may be able to rewrite the script. However, I think this is the more important point. If someone goes into like rewriting the script mode and like, okay, I'm going to really get rid of these nightmares by rewriting the script, then I think you're stuck in another cycle, which is like you're trying to calm the water by kind of pushing it down. You're creating more fear. You're creating more efforts at trying to escape something, etc., which leads to more nightmares. And then you try even harder to rewrite the script, and you have more nightmares, and then you try harder to rewrite the script. So that's my idea about that. And the other question was, do I treat nightmares as hyperarousal? I think that's the way. I'm not going to add much more because hyperarousal, we know that when we try to, it's the same thing again. When we try to fight it, stop it, then we have more. When we leave it alone, it fades. I think that is the way. Finally, here, what do I tell my brain during a nightmare? And when I read this, I was like, how can you talk to the brain when you are in a nightmare? If you find yourself in a nightmare, but you actually are conscious of what's happening and you can sort of have a conversation, then I think it's not necessarily a nightmare. You're probably in that transitional sleep. You're either already quite awake, or you're just about to wake up. So I think if you're in a nightmare and you can talk to yourself, I think maybe you're not actually in a nightmare anymore. But I think whenever we have a chance to talk to ourselves, we can just point out that if you can, then you can point out that nightmares are a normal manifestation of fear, nothing else, nothing harmful, nothing dangerous about them. Now, finally, I want to add something, to contextualize this in the very context that Philip describes it in, which is this, that When nightmares are a manifestation of the fear of having insomnia again, uh, that PTS, so that experience, things can appear complicated. Meaning, in Philip's situation, it can easily be that, okay, I have nightmares and they wake me up, and then I have trouble sleeping, and that's because I have, and the fear comes from me fearing having insomnia again, which is now what I'm having, but not because I have insomnia, just because I have a fear of the nightmares, which now disrupt my sleep. You can see that things are really complicated, but in reality, I think it's not complicated. It's like all of it is just fear, like, uh, fear of nightmares, fear of insomnia, fear of memories, which is like PTSD, right? You have this memory of an event, and you don't want to relive that event. In other words, you don't want that memory to occur again. So it's like a fear of memory, fear of nightmares, fear of insomnia. It's all just fear. And any fear, no matter what fear we have, we can always meet it with this way. We can always meet it with awareness, understanding that what's happening is a manifestation of fear. Fear is just an emotion. It's a normal human emotion. Fear is not dangerous. Fear is unpleasant, but it's just a signal. It's nothing that is, nothing else. So we can meet it with awareness, with non-action, and above all, kindness. I truly believe that when, in the context of this, if we have nightmares and we're like, I'm going to not do anything about them, let them happen, and then you find yourself actually kind of fighting them, trying to make them stop, totally normal. Meet that with kindness, and everything becomes calmer. Everything else becomes easier. So those are my thoughts on nightmares. Philip, I hope this helped you and anyone else that tunes into the channel. Let me know what your thoughts in the comments, as always. And with that said, I'll leave you for now. Bye-bye.